Yeah, that looks like it. All right. It's actually a new book series that I've started together with Professor Cengiz Erisen from Turkey a couple of years ago. And actually, what you're seeing now is the first, if not one of the first two books that are published actually in this series. The series name is the Global Perspectives in Political Psychology, and obviously the political psychology stands for scholarship on topics that are relevant both to politics and psychology, to people, to political science and areas in psychology that are interested in kind of the into this combination, for example, social psychology. And if you read the what's on the screen about what books in this series should be like, then it tells you a lot about the topic and about the content. But one thing that I want to add is the global, the first word on the title, because that's really one of the mission, the parts of the mission statement that we have for this series. Is that although, of course, it's very interesting to learn about politics and psychology in countries like the UK and in the US, where a lot of research and a lot of research efforts and a lot of research money is spent on understanding, for example, election processes. Obviously, there are a lot of other countries and other places in the world where, if we can broaden our database to also include scholarship on potentially similar or different processes in these kinds of countries, it will actually give us a much broader perspective on political psychology and on important issues in society. So the global, in this sense, really means something important in terms of variety of perspectives. Can you go to the next slide, Anna? Great. So these are the first two books that are actually now published in this series. We're very happy with them. I'm not sure whether I'm also on screen yet, but actually, if you don't like the images, then you can actually see them here as well. And you can clearly differentiate them. Now, we also have hardcover copies. And actually there, what you can see is that they also look very nice, but less differentiated. So I personally prefer the ones that are the soft covers over here. One word that I want to mention about the other book that's also being published in this series along the same times as the current book about the psychology of politically unstable societies. This is a book published by Eren Halperen and colleagues about psychological intergroup interventions. And it basically offers a collection of chapters on specific interventions in psychological interventions in intergroup conflict, for example, on contact theory, on self-affirmation. And basically all these authors offer very brief articles about, okay, so what do we know about these interventions and how effective are they? So it's a very interesting kind of resource for thinking about change in society through psychological interventions. And related to that, of course, the current book that we're talking about today, The Psychology of Politically Unstable Societies, also is related to that to some extent. That through the insights that we gain in the psychology of politically unstable societies, we also gain insights in what possibly we could do about it. Anna, could you skip to the next one? As I mentioned, I'm not doing this alone, but together with Cengiz, we're trying to create more interesting content for this series and upcoming volumes. As you can see, also touch upon themes about social unrest and social protest, and also touch upon kind of the global interest that we have. So, for example, one upcoming volume that will be coming up later in the year is about social unrest specifically in Latin America, also a region where, in terms of research, we don't know too much about in political psychology. It's a very, very interesting collection of research and chapters. And we're also working on a book in this series about social protest across cultures and political systems, and to what extent that is comparable across all these very different countries and systems. Anna, can you? Yep. So before I give the word to Anna about the book in this series, I just want to highlight a couple of things that you can also find on the back cover of the book. So in terms of the global kind of perspective of this series and about political psychology, I think it's a much needed spotlight on unstable societies. One of the key issues at the moment, I think, in societies that concern a lot of people. So therefore, it's important to kind of collect the latest developments in the field of political psychology. And Anna and Barbara have done a really nice job at doing that, as we also will hear from the other presentations today. The global part is reflected in specific geographical topic of the where these politically unstable societies are located, which is not like kind of the more mainstream focus in political psychology, which is really interesting. It covers a variety of kinds of concepts that are interesting to, I think, a broad audience and speak to the intersection between psychology and politics. And it's also very applicable in terms of trying to relate this to interventions or other kinds of influences in the real world. So with that in mind, I think it's a great book. I'm very proud to have this as the first, and especially as the first that in terms of a book launch for this series. So also on behalf of Cengiz, I want to thank Anna and Barbara for leading the way in that sense. And I think you can really be proud of this the book that you've edited. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I will give the word and the screen back to Anna.
Great, thank you very much. And sorry, I really need to technically focus on starting my own presentation, and it's hard to introduce myself while I'm doing that. Just a second. Okay. Yes. And now share again. Okay, I think this is where we stopped. Yeah, so thank you very much for the introduction of the series and also for contacting me about this idea. And first, I was very uncertain whether we should do it. And then at one point, discussing the potential topic with Barbara, I kind of fell in love with the idea of doing this book. And I'm so happy that we did it. And in some ways, it exceeded our expectations. And we feel more and more that it somehow fills a gap that was indeed missing, and we always felt it was missing. And we have a shared experience with Barbara a lot, that we have a hard time explaining the context of our studies and the relevance of our studies and problems that we find problematic to people who are from other places, especially from Western Europe or North America. And we now feel that we have a book to show for and to say, like, yeah, this kind of justifies what we've been talking about, that there are some issues that need special attention. So that's about the motivation. And let me move to a more scientific approach to introducing the book. Basically, we feel that it indeed aims to fill a gap that we had felt, but we're unable to put in words when we focus on politically unstable societies. And we feel the gap or the need was there precisely because most studies are conducted in different countries. It seems like a very simple and mundane reason for that, but simply we are all political psychologists, social psychologists, we are simply more familiar with societal issues that are happening in countries that we don't live in. So this was kind of the broad motivation. And the reason we framed it or called it political instability is not simply because there is a changing political landscape. I have a colleague who participated in there was a Hungarian book launch, an in-person book launch, and she said, this political system seems very stable. To be honest, it feels too stable. It's very hard to get rid of systems that are problematic to us. So stability is really not about rapid changes, although it possibly has something to do with this kind of short-run variability. But it's really about a lack of social trust and cooperation between citizens, a lack of balance and the proneness to change. And it really entails some kind of inability to resist destabilization and a proneness to crisis. So it's not really about the time frame of a political system, but rather how we are all striving to live in stable liberal democracies. And while our histories have these short periods of stability and prosperity and democracies, we also see that these are extremely weak and very easily changing. So we felt that this was what we meant by political instability, although sometimes it feels rather stable or even too stable. And of course, as I mentioned, one of the main problems we had that social psychology and political psychology treats social relations within these long-standing democracies as if it was the default context of human existence, or it was the default context of mental processes and human behavior, whereas we know that most of human population actually do not live in these stable liberal democracies. And it's much more common experience for most people to live in societies with social and political tensions, go through a lot of social, economic, and political crises. We see that nationalism, homophobia, prejudice against indigenous and immigrant populations, and relatedly, of course, the success of authoritarian politics and illiberalism, not to mention wars and violent conflicts, represent the reality of most people living in the world today. So we don't want to treat political instability as something unique and marginal and peripheral, but to recognize its relevance for most of humankind. So the objectives of the book was to really explore the psychological processes that explain the rise of these systems, which we call political instability. Of course, we are not the ones inventing this term. This is a common term in political science. But at the same time, to also examine the relevance of the key concepts such as trust, prejudice, nationalism for politically unstable societies that we often use in political psychology in any other context. So if we want to really distinguish the rationale of this book from a psychological perspective, we want to understand, on the one hand, what historical, political, cultural instability creates in terms of psychological responses, but also what the psychological conditions are for instability. We also argue that these are mundane. They are not the outcome of any kind of extreme psychological processes. So, for example, support for illiberal leaders is not based on psychopathology of the citizens of these countries, but rather the need to find control over situations that feel unpredictable, unjust, and people find comfort in this kind of leadership when they face threat, and in order to find control in their life. So generally speaking, we want to show that these are perfectly normal psychological processes, but they're not inevitable. So there is something to do about it, and there is a place for psychological interventions to understand how these societal political processes can be changed. And a lot of the book is focusing on Central and Eastern Europe, and I think that requires some justification. Basically, there is a growing awareness of including scholarship from the global South in almost every social science areas. There is also a growing justified critique of working with weird, so-called weird, W-E-R-D populations, and the problem of generalizing from these research to other contexts. We also believe that basic psychological processes are not different in weird and non-weird contexts, but the context is important in how these needs are fulfilled and how they influence attitude and behavior. But the relevance of the region is that it is part of the global north. Most of these countries are classified as weird, although that can be changing, of course. We've seen a lot of democratic backsliding, for example, in the region. So these countries are benefiting of the many privileges of the global north. Yet, as I mentioned, despite some periods of prosperity and democracy, it has not been able to develop the kind of political stability that characterizes many other global north and weird contexts. So it has some kind of a peculiar status. But I also want to mention that the inclusion of South Africa and data from Western Europe was very important for us. And we would have been pleased to see more of that, to also show that this is not really a political analysis of the East Central European context, but it has a more generalized relevance. But at the same time, apart from the fact that both of the editors are from this region, what makes this region unique or different or interesting? Well, partly because it has had a long history of with the question of belonging. Basically, all of its history has been characterized by belonging to the East or West. And I think in the context of the war in Ukraine, we definitely understand that this is an extremely important and central topic for many of these countries. There is the region and many of the countries can be characterized by unfinished nation building, which led to this problematic democratic transition in 1989. Or around that time, and created this instability in terms of both wanting to build liberal democracies, becoming members of the European Union, but at the same time not being able to uphold these standards. Okay, so nationalism, exclusionary prejudice, xenophobia, and so on, they are all happening in other countries, and they're very much central problems in Western countries, Western European countries, but they're much more mainstream in this region. We have a very volatile party system. I'm just seeing the time, so I'm going to go a bit faster. Basically, the whole history of benefiting from patronage but being both perpetrators and victims creates a specific psychological status, and I'm hoping that the presentation about collective narcissism will clearly highlight this, what I'm talking about. And I also like to mention that it's extremely multi-ethnic countries with a linguistically, religiously complex, diverse country. But all of these countries have a long history of assimilationism, which shows how problematic this has become. And now moving to the book, basically, this was the background of why we find this important to do a psychological analysis of political instability. And we grouped the chapters into under three main topics. One is a direct analysis of social and political processes. The second was about problems embedded in how individuals think, feel, and behave as members of groups, as this is extremely important. And finally, the consequences for intergroup relations, like xenophobia, anti-LGBTQ attitudes, and anti-Gypsyism. So, and all of these three parts contain 3 chapters, plus the introductory chapter, which is more or less what I just presented to you. So the first 3 content chapters about societal political processes, we'll hear about the first one, about trust, mostly, if I simplify it, by Girts Dimdins. Then we have a chapter analyzing proneness to right-wing authoritarianism in the context of Poland. And we have a book about the paranoid style of politics in East Central Europe with examples from Hungary and other countries from the region or outside the region. Turkey, for example. In the group processes, a tremendously interesting piece about simmering hostilities. I really find myself using this term every other day. So it kind of gave me an explanation to a lot of things that I had a hard time putting into words. And I'm really looking forward to the presentation by Sibusiso Maseko and Kevin Durrheim. We had a chapter about how crisis affects the connection between nationalism and xenophobia, an extremely interesting piece by Ksenia Chrysostou, and using the case of Greece. And then we have an interesting piece from about national and European identity, and basically understanding how national identity is affected by joining the European Union by Margareta Jelic and Vladimir Mihic. And finally, the last part is about the collective narcissism that we're going to hear about. Then we have a chapter, a gender-focused chapter using the case of Poland, about how Poland attacked basically LGBT rights and women, referring to national narcissism. And the chapter I co-edited with Barbara about anti-Gypsyism, which is an extremely severe form of ethnic prejudice that's very prevalent in the region. So these are my co-authors, but of course, you can take a look at their names and the focus of their place. And we are really proud of being able to attract so many great scholars for their work. And a little bit of marketing. We will put the link of the book where you can buy the book in the chat, and you can have a 20% discount, I think up to March, if you use the TPPUS20, which is basically the first letters of the title of the book if you want to buy it. But we'll put the link in the chat. So thank you very much for your attention. And now I stop sharing my screen and I immediately give the word to Girts to do his presentation about trust and the reservoir of goodwill.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Let me share my screen. So I hope you can see it now. So yes, my chapter is about trust, as Anna said in her introduction. So, what I'm trying to show is why the buildup of trust, both social trust and political trust in these unstable societies or societies with weak democratic traditions is so slow. And what I'm going to do is first I'm going to introduce different types of trust that I use in my analysis. Then I'm going to very quickly run through a literature review about this mechanism of buildup of trust and what are the factors that hamper this buildup. And I'm also going to show a little piece of my own research on this topic. So one distinction that I make a lot in my chapter is between particularized and generalized trust. Well, and first of all, when we speak about trust, there are various definitions, but basically, broadly speaking, that is the readiness of one party to be vulnerable to the actions of another party based on the assumption that the other party will not use this vulnerability to their advantage. There have been many things written about social trust in general, that it's basically the glue that holds society together. It's the social lubricant that makes cooperation possible or social transactions and economic transactions possible in any given society. But not all trust is equal. And when we are talking about these unstable societies, it's especially important to make a distinction between particularized trust and generalized trust. And particularized trust is, we could also call it strategic trust. It's based on rational information, rational assumption that people or groups or companies with whom the truster is dealing with, that they can be trusted. And usually it is based on some previous experience. For example, that these people are our friends, they are our acquaintances, we have had some interactions with them before, or they are members of trusted in-groups. And the other kind of trust is generalized trust, and that is trust in strangers, basically speaking. trust in all members of a given society, or most members of a given society, regardless of whether or not a particular person has proven their trustworthiness. I argue, based on analysis of literature, that in post-authoritarian societies, which mostly are societies that we are dealing with in our book, particularized trust is prevalent. Generalized trust is relatively lower, and particularized trust is prevalent based on how social life and economic life was built in these societies, where people could never be sure whom they can trust or not. So they were mostly sort of forced to build their own trust networks to get through with their lives. Another concept that is central to my chapter, and I also believe central to the book as a whole, is political trust. And basically, that is the same notion of trust, of being ready to be vulnerable to the actions of somebody else, transferred to the political context, where the other party, the trustee, is some political actor. It can be an individual politician, it can be a party, it can be an institution, or it can be the political system as a whole. And so basically, yes, that somebody is prepared to give up some of their outcomes, decisions over some of their outcomes, to some political actor. It is important to distinguish between two types of political trust. Again, one is generalized political trust, and that is trust in a political system as a whole. Although when we are talking about political system, it's not really a single concept. It consists sort of many layers, as we can see in this model suggested by Pippa Norris, that we can start speaking about political trust already from the sense of national identity, and then and that's kind of the most abstract level of trusting in the political system of a country you identify with, and then going down to what is called in this model regime values. For example, in democracies, those would be democratic principles and democratic values, and then going down to evaluation of the system performance as a whole, and then going even more concretely into evaluation of performance of specific institutions and specific political actors that are operating within these institutions. Theoretically, generalized political trust should include all these elements, but as we will shortly see, then actually individualized political trust, when we're talking about specific politicians and even specific political parties, they are perceived differently from perception of institutions or the system in general. Theoretically, they should kind of contribute to the overall generalized political trust and be affected by the overall generalized political trust, these individual trust judgments. But in real life, they may be quite separate from these more generalized judgments about the political system. So this is the central slide of my chapter, because it depicts the vicious circle of reoccurring political distrust, or reinforced political distrust in weak democratic traditions. And if we look historically, then after, if we take again, as Anna said, most of the studies we have in our book are about Eastern and Central Europe. So if we look at the time when the communist system fell apart, in the first years after gaining this political freedom, there was an increase in political trust in these post-Soviet societies or post-communist societies. But then came sort of disappointment with the economic performance, with the performance of these newly established political systems. And these societies turned out not to be quite ready for this disappointment. In other words, they were lacking what sometimes has been called in the literature the reservoir of goodwill. For political system that is present in more developed democratic societies where political institutions with their performance over many decades or even centuries, in some cases have proven that overall as a system they can be trusted, and for example that democratic principles can be trusted to be the best, etc., etc. So what happens is that there is no this reservoir of goodwill, which results, if we generalize, in quite low political trust. If we are talking about trust in system as a whole, trust in specific institutions, trust in government, and at the same time we have this prevalence of particularized trust, which I mentioned before, because again that was kind of the natural way of how social interactions were organized in these authoritarian societies or sometimes totalitarian societies. You had to be very careful with whom to trust. So, and this combination of these two factors, it results in a number of negative social, well, also psychological, but social consequences, most notably the so-called inequality trap. And that works in such a way that distrust in system leads to corruption, because people feel there's no use to going to, I don't know, to police or going to any other institution to solve their problem. It should be solved by bribing someone or by finding someone who can solve it for you based on this particularized trust, based on relationship, on being friends or being relatives or being in some way other related and thus trustable. And that leads to, well, inequality, economic inequality. It leads to lower life satisfaction because corruption, it usually hits the poorest people in the strongest way. They are the ones who cannot pay big bribes. They either have to use these ineffective institutions, or they have to, find people who can help them just to get along in their lives. Whereas for rich people, it is easy to get even richer in a corrupt system. So this leads to even lower efficacy of the system, perceived efficacy of the whole system, which leads to distrust and which again leads to more corruption. And there is also a smaller vicious circle which deals with political cynicism, which is basically a general attitude, a general evaluation of everything political as bad, so to say, as politicians, evaluation of politicians as generally selfish, as generally corrupt. And this happens even independently of these economic consequences of corruption. Corruption also directly contributes to this general negative public view of politicians as people and political system as a whole, which leads to more distrust. And of course, any case of observed system inefficacy also contributes to the general political cynicism, because those are politicians who are responsible for this lack of efficiency. And this, of course, also leads to reduced life satisfaction. And then outside of this vicious circle, although not necessarily outside, it could be part of this vicious circle, there are also multiple consequences that are related to to the phenomena that we discussed in our book. For example, people are more prone to support populist actors, populist politicians, populist political parties, perceived poor economic performance and economic inequality has been shown to be linked to higher beliefs in conspiracy theories, low political trust and especially low generalized political trust has been shown to be positively related to nationalistic attitudes. So it's the kind of the supremacist part of national identity. It's positively related to patriotism, the part of national identity which is directed towards helping in-group, but it has been negatively political trust is negatively correlated with attitudes which relate to a supremacy over outgroups and a tendency to demonstrate the advantage over other groups. And we can speculate about psychological and social pathways also to other phenomena that are touched upon in our group. In our book. The question then is how we can break this vicious circle. And before I address it, I will very briefly show the results of my own research, which are also included in the chapter, which kind of illustrate and highlight some of the difficulties that we deal with when we are thinking about where exactly we can try to break this circle. So I'm running out of time, so I will be very quick, but basically what we can observe from this analysis, this is kind of a visualization of correlations between ratings of political trust in individualized trust, generalized, and various other correlates. So three main points. There's actually very weak, if any, connection between individualized and generalized political trust. And if it is for distrusted actors, distrusted parties and politicians. So basically it means that when we trust an individual political actor, or the respondents in this case, it is seen kind of an individual, an exception to the system, not a part of the system. However, when the same actor is distrusted, they are connected to the system. They are seen as part of the system, which makes it a little bit tricky to improve the overall political trust by hoping that individual performance of these incumbents could lead to gradual increase of generalized trust. And we also see central role, so to say, of both political cynicism and general trust in system, which kind of signal the possible pathways for improving political trust. So what can be done? Basically, one can identify three possible approaches to increasing political trust, and one, which is kind of the longest and the slowest, is simply hoping that if we are living better and better, or becoming weirder and weirder in this sense of being developed and part of the first world, that it will kind of break up this vicious circle by increasing the economic equality, by reducing corruption, and also increasing the objective efficiency of political institutions. But it is really a slow and long process. So what else can be done is we can address this through education, and it can be more direct influence through teaching democratic values and civic competence, how to get involved in the political process, how to better understand the political process and understand that it's not something that is, different from the society, from a given society, or different from a given state, that the political system, the government, that it's part of what we are, and that it's actually essential to get involved into this political system. and indirectly by providing people with financial stability and ability to earn, and also by broadening the worldview and decreasing cynicism, increasing tolerance for all sorts of worldviews. And the third approach would be through mass communication. Of course, it doesn't mean that political system and individual politicians should be praised without any reason, or moreover, that one should abstain from deserved criticism. But perhaps quite a lot can be done if we observe the public discourse about politics to make it at least more neutral regarding politicians, regarding political institutions, both on traditional mass media and also on how information is conveyed in social networks. So sorry about taking a bit more time. This is the main what I wanted to tell you about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think a lot of it resonates with our personal experiences, and doesn't sound too promising about the breaking the vicious circle. At least I don't see any move in these directions. I would like to ask you to unshare your screen, and immediately I would like to give the word to Sibusiso Maseko from University of South Africa and Kevin Durrheim from University of Johannesburg, to present their work on simmering hostilities and explain to all of you what that means, especially in the context of the multi-ethnic, multiracial state of South Africa.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm glad that the phrase simmering hostilities has found its way into your vocabulary. I would like to thank you guys, Anna and Barbara, for giving Kevin and I the opportunity to contribute to this important book project. I think current events in the world, like the Israeli-Palestine conflict and the subsequent case before the International Crimes Court, where South Africa has taken the Israeli government to the International Crimes Court, show us how important it is to understand intergroup dynamics that underlie politically unstable society. And as alluded to in the introduction of this book, this edition gives scholars from non-weird countries the opportunity to provide their insights into why some societies continuously struggle with instability. In our chapter, we sought to describe how protracted, intractable conflict in South Africa, which we characterize as simmering hostilities, keeps political and the political, social, and the social landscape unstable. We conceptualize simmering hostilities as intermittent flashpoints of group-based conflict, which continuously threaten the social cohesion of settler colonies like South Africa. So in this particular chapter, we consider how intermittent flashpoints of group-based conflict, when white South Africans mobilize autochthony claims and related counterclaims of racial prejudice to undermine efforts of racial justice. So essentially, in this chapter, we really try to give the reader the ingredients of what protracted, intractable conflict looks like when it comes in the form of simmering hostilities. And our focus was on white South Africans, right? And white South Africans who form opinion-based groups and who essentially mobilize autochthony narratives or belief systems that are counter racial justice in South Africa. I'll contextualize. So South Africa's history of settler colonization and apartheid was characterized by the oppression of Black South Africans in all facets of life, meaning white South Africans enjoyed unparalleled social, political, and cultural and economic privileges. And these were at the expense of Black South Africans. This long-standing systematic oppression was characterized by more overt and consistent periods of violence. Since the fall of apartheid, in 1994, like most post-conflict societies, South Africa has had the task of undoing the racial injustices of colonization and apartheid, particularly as South Africa has adopted a liberal democratic values and declared itself a non-racial society. Despite these declarations, South Africa continues to struggle with the legacies of systematic racism. The new liberal democratic dispensation has ensured that racialized conflict is kept in check or bubbling under. But there are regular flashpoints of racialized conflict, particularly when change is being negotiated. The racial status quo is considered illegitimate by Black South Africans, and they take collective action to undo it through reparative measures and protest. They protest often drive the emergence of counter-movements that reject the premise of racial justice within the white South African community. These counter-movements come in the form of opinion-based groups which carve out distinct local identities with well-articulated and powerful ideological positions. And we borrow this idea of opinion-based groups from McCarthy's work, right? And this idea is almost like, understanding that, for instance, when we look at gender relations, a feminist is part of an opinion-based groups, whereas someone who identifies as a woman is not really part of an opinion-based groups. And it's more likely that the person who's part of the opinion-based groups would hold very sort of extreme views about the political context. So these dynamics show us that there's a lack of consensus over how South Africa should undo the effects of colonization and apartheid, and that South Africa's racial conflict is latent, and this is potentially disastrous. We argue that the ingredients of simmering hostilities lie in contested autochthony beliefs which are mobilized by white South Africans who form opinion-based groups. White South Africans have, through the course of South African history, constructed the narrative that when they settled in South Africa, that land was vacant, and that Black South Africans arrived at the same time as them, or even later. Their viewpoint undermines the common understanding of colonial history, which sees Black South Africans as indigenous people who are first inhabitants. Hence, despite not being first inhabitants, white South Africans have used this construction or version of colonial history to assert themselves as de facto natives. Contestations over who is autochthonous represent a high-stakes game for groups because they determine rightful ownership of territory and the enjoyment of related privileges. These contested autochthony narratives are mobilized more sharply by white opinion-based groups. They complicate colonial history, frustrate meaningful social change, and ultimately create fertile ground for simmering hostilities. To illustrate simmering hostilities, we draw on a case involving the contestation of place names in South Africa's capital city, Pretoria. This contestation was mainly between AfriForum, which is a civil society organization, and opinion-based group, which represents the interests of Afrikaner-speaking South Africans, and the EFF, which is a political party that represents the interests of Black South Africans. So what we really tried to do in this chapter was to bring forth this, or to rather bring you guys a case, an analysis of a case that we looked at, and this is one of the common sort of battles in South Africa towards racial justice and racial equality, and this is around street names. So what essentially happened is that the ANC-led government in Pretoria has started changing street names, and they also wanted to change the name of Pretoria, which is the capital city. And then we find this contestation between AfriForum, which is an Afrikaner-led group. So for those who don't have context, in South Africa, we have two sort of distinct or somewhat distinct settler groups, which is white South Africans who are English-speaking and Afrikaner South Africans who are Afrikaner-speaking. And they have distinct, you could say, historical roots in South Africa, yet at some point they had conflict and they found some cooperation. So this is the context of the simmering hostilities, or of a case of simmering hostility that we examine in our chapter. This flashpoint, as I said, was sparked by the replacement of old colonial and apartheid-era street names with ones that represent the racial and cultural diversity of a democratic South Africa. For context, colonial and apartheid South Africa almost exclusively represented white South African culture in place naming. Hence, changes of place names are often characterized by the replacement of prominent white South Africans or white South African artifacts with prominent Black leaders who fought against apartheid. And the picture that I show you currently is actually quite fitting, because what it shows is the replacement of the word voortrekkers. Now, the voortrekkers are a central part of white Afrikaner South Africans culture, right? The voortrekkers probably, or rather the movement of the voortrekker from the Cape to what is now Gauteng, the Transvaal, has played a central role in carving out and constructing what we know as an Afrikaner or white South African Afrikaner identity in South Africa. And now you can imagine that the ANC-led government has decided that, no, we also need to find representation in South Africa, racial representation as well. And what they did was replace it with the name of a prominent freedom fighter in the name of Steve Biko, who's part of the Black consciousness movement. So you can imagine, the tensions that this change created in South Africa. You can imagine that, and how this made a lot of Afrikaner-speaking South Africans upset. Reacting to this change, AfriForum youth changed the new street names back to the old apartheid-era streets names. They said this was because they were merely reclaiming their heritage. The EFF retaliated by spray painting these apartheid-era street names in red and retorted saying that the reclaiming of heritage by AfriForum is the promotion of white supremacy and colonialism. So as you can see, we see this contestation and this tension between groups and this tug of war over how and who should be represented. AfriForum's reaction to street name changes illustrates the contestation of autochthony. When AfriForum states that they're reclaiming their heritage, they imply that they're legitimate owners of South Africa. In other words, they're recycling a version of colonial history which claims that their ancestors settled on vacant land, and they equally have entitlement to South Africa. Or they have equal entitlement to South Africa as Black South Africans. And what another interesting sort of move that white South Africans, especially in these opinion-based groups, use is that they also sort of reframe what prejudice is, right? These autochthonous claims are used to reframe the meaning of prejudice. That is, white South Africans in opinion-based groups in South Africa often respond to measures that seek racial justice, like street name changes, with accusations of reverse racism. So what eventually happens is groups like AfriForum, in protest of regarding changes of this nature, they then complain or advocate as though they are suffering from reverse racism. In closing, our chapter attempted to show how autochthony narratives can be used as an ideological resource to maintain the privileges of colonization and apartheid in South Africa when co-opted by white opinion-based groups. Crucially, we attempted to show that they maintain simmering hostilities between white and Black South Africans when crucial moments of social change are being negotiated, especially in this case when Black South Africans are advocating for representation. Our theoretical argument is not fully supported by recent empirical evidence. The work of Martinovic and Noitgedacht in the Netherlands, which suggests that white settlers in settler colonies consistently support versions of autochthony that acknowledge indigenous groups as first inhabitants. However, these studies do not consider how autochthony is mobilized by opinion-based groups amongst white settlers. What is also interesting, and this is something that could be considered in future, is that even though Black South Africans mobilize autochthony narratives to undo the racial injustices of the past, in post-apartheid South Africa, they also mobilize these narratives to justify anti-immigrant sentiments which are directed at African and Asian immigrants. In closing, simmering hostilities seem to find place in contexts that are political and are having social transitions, and are maintained by competing accounts of who arrived on our territory first and which group is the territory's rightful owner. These competing accounts are not mere disagreements about histories of settlement, but have the potential to spark violent intergroup conflict in settler colonies like South Africa. Thank you. That's the end.
Thank you very much. I think we learned a lot from this presentation, both in terms of theory, but also about the context. And so, because the time is short, I'm immediately giving over the word to Agnieszka, Golec, Zavala, and Oliver Keenan from Goldsmiths University in London to present their work on collective narcissism. And it's extremely interesting and a very new angle about taking both advantaged and disadvantaged groups' perspectives. So I assume we'll learn a lot from this too. So the floor, yeah, we see your shared screen, so the floor is yours. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today with us. And thank you especially to Anna and Barbara for bringing us together in this very interesting endeavor of putting this book together. Thank you to Martijn for being an editor of this really interesting series. I think this is something very exciting, as you can see also in those presentations. I think what Oli and I want to do today is to actually show that some processes may be very similar and weird and non-weird samples or societies. That was actually my impression when I was listening to Girts' presentation. I was thinking, like, with democratic traditions, I mean, we are here in London, in UK, we are one of the strongest democratic traditions, and that model would perfectly apply to all of this disillusionment that we are experiencing with the political system today. So, and I think what we're going to talk about is a little bit more also, like, in a sense, generalizing, because we're talking about an individual difference variable that contributes to the intergroup attitudes that are destabilizing societies. We're talking about collective narcissism. Yeah, so I'm going to present the gist of the theory of our paper, but we actually also reviewed some new research that came especially from comparison of collective narcissism in disadvantaged and advantaged social groups, and that was a part of Oli's doctoral thesis. So I will talk about the theory behind it, previous studies, while Oli is going to talk about this research that particularly compares those attitudes. Actually, I'm sorry for crashing the book launch. I also wrote the book, and you can see it on this slide, just in case you want to find out more about collective narcissism, because for the time limits, I'll be talking about it quite shortly. Now, how do I change the slide here? Okay, so just to briefly mention the concept of collective narcissism, it's an aspect of in-group identification, so the extent to which membership in social group is psychologically consequential. It's a specific aspect of in-group identification that pertains to its over-exaggerated positive evaluation, but what is really crucial to collective narcissism is the demand for external recognition of the group's exaggerated greatness. And in that sense, I see collective narcissism as a projection of a narcissistic need to be recognized as better than others on the social level of the self. Through the years of research on collective narcissism, we managed to establish that this is an individual difference variable in the sense that people hold narcissistic beliefs about their groups with a relative degree of stability within a person and also across social identities. So that means that having a narcissistic belief about one group you belong to, like a nation, will correspond and will be correlated positively with you having a narcissistic belief about other groups you might also belong to. And this is going to be important for our consideration later. And there is an important qualification on the strength of this association. That is something that Oli in his doctoral studies discovered. But one of the quite robust and replicated findings from early collective narcissism research was that it is an individual difference, robust predictor of intergroup hostility. And it predicts intergroup hostility over and above known individual difference predictors such as authoritarianism, social dominance orientation, the ones that were mentioned in the book. And it does so especially in the context of perceived intergroup threat. And speaking of vicious circles, we will speak about one as well. Here, there seems to be a vicious circle of the association, sort of self-perpetuating circle of the association between collective narcissism, exaggerated perception of hostility of others, always being a victim, as you mentioned, Anna, in the beginning, that sort of feeling, always being threatened by hostility of others and the necessity to respond to this hostility aggressively. So the link between collective narcissism and intergroup hostility, intergroup aggression is strengthened under the perceived threat to the in-group image, but also those beliefs about external threat serve as justification for that hostility. Can we go to another slide? So lots of studies showed that national narcissism, particularly, so the belief about the unrecognized greatness and entitlement of one's own nation, is a predictor of intergroup hostility in the sense of like increased nationalism, preference for national supremacy and militaristic sort of aggressive actions of achieving it. But we also found out in numerous studies that national narcissism actually predicts prejudice towards minorities within the country. So when we speak about how it destabilizes society, well, societies is destabilizing them because it excludes people who are members of it, or at least it predicts treating those people as a sort of, as we have the saying in Poland, worst kind. This is how we were called, the women, like liberals, worst kind by our government. So in that sense, collective narcissism national predicts that. And can we go to the next one? What we wanted to show, to actually examine in all this research was particularly, but we looked at it inspired by previous research, was that we need to take into consideration that people identify at the same time with groups that differ in the level of abstraction. So subordinate group like a nation, but also subordinate groups organized within those nations, always organized hierarchically. And the thing that we find in previous studies is that there's a very interesting overlap in the prediction of national narcissism and the prediction of collective narcissism with reference to advantage groups. Can we go next? Not this one. So actually, lots of previous studies showed that white collective narcissism as national or American collective narcissism predicts racism. In Poland, we found that Polish collective narcissism predicts sexism, but also male collective narcissism predicts sexism. There's an interesting study coming from Indonesia showing that Muslim collective narcissism, the majority of religion there, predicts prejudice towards the religious minorities. So there is an interesting overlap in the prediction of collective narcissism on the nation level and advantage group levels. That is not particularly surprising because we know from other studies that advantaged groups project their in-group, its image, its goals on the whole nation. But we found that this is particularly strong on with reference to or predicted by collective narcissism. Now, what we are interested in is what happens with in the disadvantaged groups, because what we found, for example, that women who in Poland who embraced Polish national collective narcissism would embrace sexism. So they would embrace the beliefs that legitimize their own disadvantage. So in that sense, national narcissism is an obstacle in pursuit of equality and allyship between men and women, but also pursued in women engaging in collective action for advancement of their own emancipation of their own group. But we are interested in what's going to happen to women who embrace collective narcissism with reference to their gender group. Because you see, collective narcissism, what it does to people, it just makes them want to advance their positive image and interests of their group in an antagonistic and aggressive way. So, but in the context of disadvantaged and advantaged groups, those interests are opposite. So it is in the interest of disadvantaged groups to emancipate, to achieve greater equality, and achieve a better possibility of access to resources and power. While it is in the interest of disadvantaged groups, the antagonistically understood interest, to actually maintain or even strengthen the existing social inequality. So basically, we were trying to test and looked into how collective narcissism predicts pursuit of equality in two contexts, Polish and American, gender equality and racial equality. One thing that I need to say, the last thing before I give the floor to Oli, is that in both of those societies, we found that gender collective narcissism among women and men, as you can see on this slide, or ethnic collective narcissism among whites and blacks equally predict antagonistic attitude in the intergroup relations and the perception of those intergroup as a zero-sum conflict. Okay, so it always predicts antagonism without any difference. But when it comes to attitudes towards equality and engagement in collective action, or beliefs in legitimization or beliefs legitimizing inequality, we will see an interesting difference. Only go from overlap between national and subgroup.
Right. Hello, everyone. So we were interested in how advantaged would claim the national identity as their own nation and then make it to represent their advantaged needs, as kind of plays out with right-wing populism. So we expected for there to be a strong correlation between the subordinate level collective narcissism among advantaged groups and their national collective narcissism. And so we find that across 4 samples in the US, including 2 samples of whites and blacks, and 1 sample of whites and Latinx, and 2 samples of Polish men and women. And you can see these slopes here. On the top right, you've got the gender samples, and bottom left, you have the racial samples. And you can see that whites and men are on top. They have a stronger coefficient. We're also interested across different indices of ideology or support for reactionary social change versus progressive social change. So we looked at ideological support for reactionary social change, expressed as conservatism, legitimization of gender equality as the correct way of doing things, and as general egalitarianism, the view that people should be equal in society and we should distribute money to the poor. Again, we were expecting this crossover interaction at this movement level. So as they have counter interests, the advantaged subgroups would show support for anti-egalitarianism, and disadvantaged groups would show support for egalitarianism. And we see this here, we've got these crossover interactions, more supporting conservatism, legitimization of gender equality and rejecting egalitarianism, females showing the opposite pattern. We replicated this in the racial samples in the US, again showing that white collective narcissists would support the legitimization of racial inequality and support anti-egalitarianisms. Blacks would show the opposite pattern, and again in the sample of whites and Latinx, the same pattern emerged. We're also interested in not just the ideological support for social change, but collective action intentions and participation in some cases. So in the Polish context, we had the assault on female reproductive rights, abortion rights, and the All Poland women's strike movement that came out against that. So we took that as an opportunity to look at male and female support for this movement. Expecting this crossover interaction is not as clear as it is in ideological attitudes, but we see this strong support. We also took measures of normative collective action, so that's collective action that is margin bounded, and also non-collective collective action, those which involves blocking roads, or might be illegal, potentially violent. And again, across these outcomes, female collective narcissism predicted strong support. Again, to replicate in the US context, looking at the Black Lives Matter movement and at the support for the outright. So Black Lives Matter attitudes that police need to be tight control on police killings of black people in the US. And participation in the marches, and also looking at state repression of Black Lives Matter, that the police should be stamping out the marches, they should be tapping activist phones, and then outright support. So this would be used such that as White Lives Matter, that whites are losing cultural and demographic primacy in the US. And we're again expecting this crossover interaction across these outcomes, and we found the same pattern with white collective narcissism supporting state repression, rejection participation, that showing the opposite pattern, and white collective narcissism showing support for the outright, and Latinx collective narcissists rejecting this support. All of these associations are unique to collective narcissism over in group satisfaction. So these are even partial relationships with the subordinate level collective narcissism in group satisfaction accounted for. Thanks very much.
So maybe I just want to stress this last point that Oli just said. Those predictions are unique to collective narcissism in comparison to other aspects of in-group identification. We compare to in-group satisfaction, so non-narcissistic positive evaluation of the in-group, and also in-group centrality. So how important this advantage in-group is to my sense of identity. And it was only collective narcissism that actually predicted the intention to engage in collective action to emancipate the disadvantaged group. Now, Anna, do I have time to summarize or not really?
I can give you another minute. I think we are okay. I mean, we have 10 minutes left from the meeting, but that's fine.
So just to wrap it up, how collective narcissism contributes or is involved in the stabilization of society. It is because it is a variable that predicts intergroup hostility, but it also predicts the usurpation of the subordinate group by advantage group. So in advantage group, it actually motivates the tendency to present the interests of the dominant group as a national interest. So, you know, like persecuting women somehow is in the interest of the all Poles. And if people buy to this ideology, then that makes them more aggressive towards minorities. If they are in minorities, they buy into their own oppression, they internalize oppression. The collective narcissism and advantage groups make people less likely to actually understand equality as an important social goal and act as an ally of disadvantaged groups. What happens in disadvantaged groups is actually of interest, I would say, because collective narcissism would motivate them to hold egalitarian attitudes and engage in a collective action to pursue equality. But let's say this is impaired and thwarted and meets with oppression. Those are people who are not going to stop, and they are going to radicalize. And we've seen results coming from other labs showing that collective narcissism in ethnic minorities in radicalized social contexts is actually related to preference for terrorist action, including suicide terrorists. So it is a factor that contributes to the risk of radicalization of disadvantaged groups if their interests are not treated seriously. So I think it's also an important finding because we present some proposition of how we can argue for a different form of in-group identification within each group that is not narcissistic, but still positive. I think that's it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you both for the presentation. And I think I was correct to say that we learned something. And one of the things I really like about this book, that almost all chapters, perhaps all chapters, have some theoretical advancement as well. So it's really not an analysis of a place and time and a historical phenomenon. It's using these mostly as case studies to present some important theoretical contributions. And thank you very much for all three presentations. I think you nicely highlighted the main topics and fields and frameworks of our work. And I'd like to welcome Barbara here, who, sorry, Oli, could you share your screen, please, so we see each other better? So Barbara has made it back, and we agreed that if she makes it back, then she will moderate the Q&A. So I let her take over.